Story 1. What started as a simple Saturday morning cleaning out the attic at my parents' house turned into a chain of events that completely flipped my understanding of my family upside down. I'm talking about a hidden past, a secret love affair, mysterious deaths, and a discovery that still haunts me to this day. If you're the kind of person who loves slow burn mysteries with crazy twists, stick with me. I promise this story gets wilder the deeper we go. But let me warn you up front, it's not a happy tale. This is a family mystery that's been buried for decades, and maybe for a good reason. I can't believe I'm even telling it, but it's been eating away at me since it happened. Maybe talking about it here will help me make sense of it all, or at least share some of the weight I've been carrying. So, without further ado, let me tell you how my seemingly ordinary life got thrown into a dark spiral the day I found an old wooden box hidden in my parents' attic. It was about a month ago, on a bright, chilly Saturday morning. My parents had been planning to sell their house, the same one they'd lived in for over 30 years, and were in the middle of the daunting task of decluttering before putting it on the market. Now, my dad's a bit of a hoarder. He's got that "I'll need this someday" mentality, so every closet, drawer, and especially the attic, was stuffed with random things that had been collected over the years. Naturally, my mom called me over to help clear out the attic, knowing my dad wouldn't do it himself. I remember climbing up the rickety wooden ladder into the attic, greeted by the familiar smell of dust and old cardboard. It was packed to the brim with boxes, old furniture, and stuff I hadn't seen in decades. It was like a time capsule of my childhood and beyond. Christmas decorations from the 90s, old VHS tapes, forgotten photo albums. I was lost in nostalgia for a while until I noticed something strange. There, behind a pile of yellowing newspapers, was a small, wooden box. It wasn't like the other random stuff up there. The box looked out of place. It wasn't dusty like everything else, and it had this weird, almost eerie, vibe to it. It was locked with a rusty old padlock, and the wood was weathered and worn, like it had been through some serious history. I called down to my dad, asking, "Hey, what's this box?" I expected him to brush it off, maybe tell me it was just some old junk. But when he came up the ladder and saw what I was holding, his entire face changed. I've never seen him look like that before. He went pale. Like, the color literally drained from his face. He told me, "That box, that's nothing. Just leave it alone, okay?" Naturally, that only piqued my curiosity. He turned around and climbed back down, clearly uncomfortable. And I just stood there, staring at the box, trying to make sense of why something so small could freak my dad out so badly. After a minute of debating with myself, I decided, screw it, I needed to know what was inside. My curiosity got the better of me. I carried the box down to the garage where I knew my dad kept his tools. The padlock was old and rusty, so it didn't take much effort to break it with a hammer and screwdriver. The lock shattered easily, but the second I broke it, I got this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. You know that gut feeling you get when you're about to uncover something you really shouldn't? Yeah, that was me. I hesitated for a second before opening the lid. Inside, the first thing I saw was a bundle of old letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a thin piece of fraying twine. Beneath the letters was something even more bizarre, a faded black and white photograph. The image was of a group of people standing in front of what looked like an old farmhouse. In the photo, I immediately recognized one of the men. It was my grandfather. I'd recognize him anywhere from the stories my dad told growing up. But something was off. In the photo, my grandfather wasn't standing next to my grandmother. Instead, he had his arm around a woman I'd never seen before, and in his other arm was a baby. My brain short-circuited for a second as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this woman? And who was the baby? The dates on the letters indicated they were from the 1940s, long before my grandfather met my grandmother. It didn't make any sense, and yet, the more I looked at the picture, the more I was sure. That was my grandfather. And this woman wasn't some stranger. The way he stood with her, The way his hand rested on her shoulder, it was clear they were more than acquaintances. This wasn't just some random family photo. This was something else, something hidden. I untied the bundle of letters, my hands shaking slightly. I had no idea what I was about to uncover, but I knew this was important. The letters were written in a delicate, looping cursive handwriting. The first few were love letters. They were from the woman in the photo. Her name was Margaret, and they were addressed to my grandfather. As I read through them, the story began to unfold. My grandfather and Margaret had been in love. Deeply in love. The letters talked about stolen moments, secret meetings, and plans to run away together. And then, about halfway through the stack of letters, Margaret began mentioning the baby. She wrote about how excited she was for their future as a family, how they would raise the baby together far away from her father, who disapproved of their relationship. It was clear that Margaret came from a wealthy family. There were subtle hints in the letters about her father's status and influence. But the deeper I got into the letters, the more uneasy I became. Because something had clearly gone wrong. The tone of the letters shifted dramatically. In the earlier ones, she was hopeful, full of love for my grandfather and their child. But as I kept reading, things started to unravel. Margaret's words became more frantic, more desperate. She talked about how my grandfather had stopped visiting her, how weeks had gone by with no word from him, and how she was scared for herself and scared for their baby. Then came the letter that gave me chills. Margaret wrote that she had seen a man outside her farmhouse, watching her through the windows. She didn't know who he was, but he came at night, lurking in the shadows. She was terrified. She begged my grandfather to come back, to protect them. But that letter, it was the last one. The letters stopped abruptly after that. By the time I finished reading the letters, I felt like I had stumbled into something I was never supposed to know. Something my family had buried. I needed answers, and I knew exactly who to ask. I went straight to my dad, clutching the box in my hands, and laid it all out on the table in front of him. The letters, the photo, everything. For a moment, he just stared at it all in silence, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he looked at me and said, "Where did you find this?" I told him it was in the attic, hidden behind some old boxes. He looked almost defeated, like he'd been hoping this day would never come. He took a deep breath and sat down, motioning for me to do the same. "There's a lot you don't know about your grandfather," he began. And to be honest, I didn't know most of it until I found that box years ago myself. He went on to tell me that the woman in the letters, Margaret, had indeed been involved with my grandfather before he met my grandmother. They were in love, but Margaret's father was a powerful, dangerous man who didn't approve of their relationship. When he found out Margaret was pregnant, he threatened my grandfather, told him to leave Margaret and the baby or face the consequences. My grandfather was forced to make an impossible choice, leave the woman he loved and their child, or risk his entire future. My dad explained that my grandfather had always been haunted by that decision, but he'd never spoken of it. Not to my dad, not to my grandmother, not to anyone. He'd taken that secret to the grave, until now. But what my dad told me next shook me to my core. After hearing my dad's story, I couldn't stop thinking about the letters, about Margaret, about the baby. What had happened to them? Were they okay? Did Margaret manage to raise the baby on her own, or had something terrible happened? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, so I did what anyone with an internet connection and a morbid curiosity would do. I started digging. I spent hours online, searching through old records, local history websites, anything that might give me a clue about Margaret and what happened to her after my grandfather left. Eventually, after combing through archives and old maps, I found it. The farmhouse from the photo still existed. It was located about an hour's drive from where I lived, in a small, rural town. The place had been abandoned for decades, but the property records matched the time frame of the letters. This was it, the place where Margaret had lived, and possibly where everything had gone wrong. I knew I had to see it for myself. The next morning, I got in my car and drove out to the farmhouse. It took me down winding country roads, far from any town or sign of modern life. When I finally arrived, the sight of the house sent a chill down my spine. It was exactly like the photo, only now, it was dilapidated, overgrown with weeds, the windows shattered and the roof caving in. But it was unmistakably the same place. I walked around the property, trying to imagine what it must have been like when Margaret and the baby lived there. That's when I noticed something I hadn't expected, an old, overgrown cemetery plot behind the house. There were only a few gravestones, most of them so weathered that the names were barely legible. But one stone stood out. It was newer than the others, though still old enough to be covered in moss. The name on the stone, Margaret. My heart sank as I stared at the grave. Margaret had died in 1957, just a few years after the last letter was written. And next to her, in a smaller, unmarked grave, was a second headstone. There was no name on it, just the date, 1955. The baby. It had to be. I felt a wave of nausea as the realization hit me. Margaret and the baby had both died not long after my grandfather was forced to leave them. But how? Why? I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened here, something that went beyond just a broken heart. I left the farmhouse that day with more questions than answers. My dad had told me what he knew, but there were still too many pieces missing. And the more I thought about that final letter, the one where Margaret mentioned the man lurking outside her farmhouse, the more I felt like there was something darker at play. I couldn't let it go. So I started asking around. I visited the town nearest the farmhouse, went to the local diner, and started talking to people. Most of them didn't remember much about the place. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could recall. But there was one old man who remembered. He must have been in his late 80s, sitting at a booth by the window. When I showed him the photo of the farmhouse, his eyes widened a bit, and he gave me a slow, knowing nod. That place, he said, there's a lot of bad history there. He told me that when he was a boy, the farmhouse had been owned by a wealthy family, but there were always rumors about what happened there. He remembered hearing stories about a woman named Margaret who had lived there with her baby. He said she had died under mysterious circumstances, but there were whispers in town that her death hadn't been an accident. He also mentioned something else. There were rumors about a man who had been seen around the property late at night, watching Margaret and the baby. Some people thought it was her father, trying to scare her into submission. Others thought it was someone even worse, someone hired to make sure Margaret never revealed the truth about her relationship with my grandfather. I left the diner feeling sick to my stomach. Whoever that man was, I had no doubt in my mind that he had something to do with Margaret's death, and possibly the baby's, too. I went back to my dad's house that night, my mind racing. I showed him the photos of the graves and told him what the old man at the diner had said. My dad sat in silence for a long time, staring at the pictures. Finally, he spoke. "I never knew," he said quietly. "I never knew they died." He looked so broken, so utterly devastated by the weight of this new information. All these years, he had believed that his father had simply left Margaret and the baby behind. He had no idea they had both died so soon after. He had no idea that their lives might have been cut short by the actions of someone else, someone in their family. We sat in silence for a while, both of us trying to process everything. My dad told me that he wished he could go back in time and change things, but of course, that was impossible. The past was the past, and all we could do now was try to make sense of it. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. About the secrets our families keep from us, the things that get buried, both figuratively and literally. I can't shake the image of Margaret and the baby, alone in that farmhouse, with a man in the shadows watching them. I can't help but wonder if my grandfather had known the full extent of what happened, if he would have done anything differently. And most of all, I wonder how much of our past is still lurking out there, waiting to be uncovered. So, Reddit, that's my story. What started as an ordinary day cleaning out an attic turned into the unraveling of my family's darkest secret. A secret that had been buried for decades, hidden away in an old wooden box. I still don't know if I'll ever get over what I found. Part of me wishes I'd never opened that box, that I'd left those letters unread, that I'd never gone to that farmhouse. But another part of me feels like this story needed to come out, that Margaret and her baby deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. I'm sharing this with you all because I can't carry this alone anymore. Maybe by putting it out into the world, I can finally start to make peace with it. Or maybe not. Either way, I know one thing for sure. Sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried. Story 2. My best friend went missing, but he left me a series of clues, and what I found changed everything. I'm writing this because I don't know who else to tell. It's been a little over a year since my best friend, Nick, went missing. I've tried to move on with my life, but I can't shake what happened. The truth is, I don't even know where to begin because this story is so bizarre, so unnerving, that even now I can't believe it myself. Nick wasn't just some guy I knew, he was like a brother to me. We grew up together, did everything together, and then, one day, he was just gone. No goodbye, no warning. But Nick didn't just vanish without a trace. Before he disappeared, he left something behind. A set of cryptic clues, almost like a puzzle for me to solve. It wasn't a game. It was real, too real, and I'm about to share with you everything I've uncovered. You might want to sit tight for this one, because it only gets weirder as it goes. And in the end, you might be left with more questions than answers. I know I am. Nick and I have been best friends for as long as I can remember. We grew up in the same small town, went to the same school, and even ended up working at the same tech firm after college. He was the kind of guy who could make friends with anyone, always up for an adventure, always full of energy. But something changed about a year before he disappeared. He started pulling away from people, including me. He'd skip out on plans, disappear for days at a time without explaining where he'd been. When I asked him about it, he'd just shrug it off, saying he was working on something and that he'd tell me when the time was right. I assumed he was busy with work or maybe a new relationship, so I didn't push. Then one day, Nick stopped answering his phone. His apartment was empty, completely cleared out. No one had heard from him, and his family was just as clueless as I was. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I went to the police, filed a missing persons report, but weeks turned into months, and there was nothing. No leads, no trace, nothing. I was devastated. I couldn't accept that my best friend was just gone like that. But then, a few months after Nick vanished, I got a package. It was postmarked 2 days before he disappeared. Inside was a single piece of paper with just 5 words on it, "Find me where it started." I was confused, shaken. It was Nick's handwriting, but what the hell was he talking about? I didn't even know where to begin. Find me where it started. Those words echoed in my mind over and over as I sat staring at the note. I went over every possibility, where what started. Our friendship. His work. It didn't make sense. Then it hit me, our treehouse. When we were kids, we used to have a treehouse deep in the woods behind our neighborhood. We built it together one summer, spent practically every day there. It was our secret hideout, the place where we'd go to escape the world. If there was anywhere Nick would have wanted me to look, it was there. The next day, I went back to our old neighborhood and trekked through the woods. The treehouse was still standing, though barely. The wood had rotted in places, and vines had overtaken most of it, but it was there. Climbing up, I felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with something darker. This was where it started, our adventures, our secrets. Inside, it was mostly empty, but tucked in a corner, under a loose floorboard, was a small envelope. My heart was pounding as I opened it. Inside was another note, this time longer. The handwriting was a little messy, like he'd written it in a hurry. It said, "They're watching. I had to leave. But this is only the beginning. Don't trust anyone. Follow the signs. Look at the stars." At the bottom was a strange symbol. It looked like a constellation, or maybe a map. I wasn't sure. But I knew this wasn't just some elaborate prank. This was real. Nick was trying to tell me something. Something serious. Something dangerous. I took the note home and stared at it for hours, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. They're watching. I had to leave. Who was watching him? What was he talking about? And then the part about the stars, it stuck with me. Nick had always been fascinated by space. He used to drag me out to stargaze when we were kids, pointing out constellations, talking about how small we were compared to the universe. I figured the constellation-like symbol on the note had to mean something. I spent the next week researching star charts, trying to match the symbol Nick had drawn to an actual constellation. At first, nothing lined up. It was frustrating. But then, late one night, I found it. It wasn't a constellation, it was a place. A set of coordinates, hidden in plain sight. I plugged them into Google Maps, and what popped up was strange. It wasn't a specific address, just a remote stretch of land in the middle of nowhere, about 3 hours from where I lived. Something in my gut told me this was the next step. I packed a bag, filled my car with gas, and headed out the next morning. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I had to know. I had to follow the trail Nick had left behind. The coordinates led me to the edge of a dense forest. There was no road, no path, just wilderness. I parked my car and started walking, pushing through thick trees and overgrown bushes. I kept thinking, what the hell am I doing? This is insane. But I couldn't stop. I had to find Nick. After nearly an hour of hiking, I saw it. A small, weathered cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, run down and forgotten. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. The door was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something on the wall. A photo. It was of me and Nick. I walked over to the photo, my heart racing. It was an old picture, one I didn't even remember being taken. We were kids, sitting in front of our treehouse, grinning at the camera. But something about the photo wasn't right. In the background, behind us, there was a figure, blurred and shadowy, almost like a smudge on the image. But the longer I stared at it, the more certain I became that it wasn't just a smudge. Someone had been watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine. On the floor below the photo was another envelope. My hands shook as I picked it up and opened it. You're getting close. But be careful. They know you're looking now. I froze. They? Who were they? I didn't have time to figure it out. As I stood there, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone, or something, was approaching. I bolted out of there, sprinting through the woods until I reached my car. I didn't stop driving until I was back home, heart pounding, hands shaking. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left my apartment, every time I went to work, I had this nagging sensation that someone was following me. At first, I thought it was just paranoia after what happened at the cabin. But then things started to get stranger. I noticed a black car parked across the street from my building, always the same car, always in the same spot. I'd catch glimpses of it in my rearview mirror when I was driving. And then there were the phone calls. Late at night, my phone would ring, but when I answered, no one would speak. Just silence. I was losing it, feel myself spiraling. I kept thinking about the notes Nick left. They're watching. Don't trust anyone. But who the hell was they? Who was watching us? One night, after another silent phone call, I decided to do something reckless. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and headed out to confront the car that had been following me. I was done playing games. When I got outside, the car was there again, parked under a streetlight. But this time, as I approached it, the engine started, and it sped off before I could get close. I chased after it on foot, running through the empty streets like a madman, but it was long gone. When I got back to my apartment, there was a note taped to my door. No envelope this time, just a single sheet of paper with 4 words. Stop looking for him. At this point, I was scared out of my mind, but I couldn't stop. Nick was still out there, and I needed to know the truth. I spent days locked in my apartment, poring over every clue, every detail, trying to piece together what had happened. And then, finally, I found something. Hidden in the corner of one of the notes, in handwriting so small I almost missed it, was another set of coordinates. They led to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, in an industrial area no one ever went to. I didn't hesitate. I knew this was it. The final piece of the puzzle. When I arrived at the warehouse, the place was deserted. Rusted metal doors, broken windows. It looked like no one had been there in years. But as I stepped inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Nick. He was standing there, in the center of the room, alive, but different. He looked exhausted, gaunt, like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. When he saw me, his face broke into a weak smile, but his eyes were filled with fear. "They're coming," he whispered. "We don't have much time." That's where the story ends, Reddit. I don't know who they are or why they're after us. Nick told me some things before we had to run, things I still can't fully process. But we're on the move now, hiding, constantly looking over our shoulders. I'm sharing this because if something happens to me, I want someone to know. I want someone to keep looking. Maybe one day, the full truth will come out. But for now, all I can do is run. Story 3. I took a job as a night watchman in a remote town, but no one told me what really happens after dark. I took a job as a night watchman in a small, remote town because I needed the money, not because I thought it would be exciting. I had just gone through a rough patch, got laid off, bills piling up, and this was one of the only things I could find on short notice. The town, Fairhaven, wasn't even on most maps. Population, 302. A place so quiet, you'd think time had forgotten about it. The job was simple. Sit in an old, half-abandoned factory at the edge of town, make sure no one broke in, and occasionally walk the perimeter. It was a cushy gig, but there was one catch. I had to work nights. Midnight to 6 a.m. Not ideal, but I figured I'd survive. The first few nights were uneventful. It was exactly what I expected, boring. I'd bring a book, scroll through my phone when there was reception, and occasionally wander around the factory's dark, creaky halls. The building was ancient, probably built in the early 1900s, and felt more like a relic than an actual workplace. It was strange, though. No one ever told me what the factory used to produce. The few workers I ran into at the bar were cagey, like they didn't want to talk about it. By the third night, things started to feel off. There were moments when I swore I could hear faint whispers coming from the old offices upstairs. But when I went to check, there was nothing. Just empty rooms filled with dust and rusted equipment. I chalked it up to my imagination or the wind sneaking through the cracks in the walls. Then came the night I saw the first sign that something was very, very wrong. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting at my desk in the security office, half asleep, when I saw it on the surveillance monitor. A figure, barely visible, moving down one of the hallways. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the camera or maybe a homeless guy who had wandered in. But when I zoomed in, my heart skipped a beat. The figure wasn't walking. It was floating. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, gliding through the air about 2 feet off the ground. I could barely make out any features, just a pale shape against the dark hallway, like a shadow that had decided to come alive. My brain was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real, right? I had to be overtired, hallucinating. I grabbed my flashlight and ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got to the spot where I had seen the figure, there was nothing. Just silence and the distant hum of the building's ancient heating system. I was ready to write it off as a weird glitch, but then, something else happened. The air around me got colder. Not just a little chilly, freezing. I could see my breath in front of me, even though the rest of the building was warm. The temperature drop was so sudden, I felt like I had walked into a freezer. And then, I heard it. A voice. Whispering my name. At this point, I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. I bolted back to the security office and spent the rest of my shift with the lights on, trying to pretend none of it had happened. But that was just the beginning. The next night, things escalated. It started with the cameras glitching. Every feed went static for about 5 seconds at exactly 1:17 a.m. When the picture came back, the building looked the same, except for one thing. In every camera feed, there was a door standing open. A door that had been locked when I made my rounds earlier. It wasn't just one door, though. It was all of them. Every single door in the factory, wide open, as if someone, or something, had gone through and unlocked each one. I immediately grabbed my flashlight and went to check, but by the time I got there, all the doors were closed and locked again. That's when I started to feel like something was watching me. I can't explain it, but you know that feeling when someone's standing just behind you, even though you can't see or hear them. That cold, prickly sensation crawling up your neck. That's what I felt. Constantly. Every time I turned a corner or passed a dark room, it felt like something was just out of sight, hiding in the shadows. I was starting to question my sanity at this point. I mean, I had heard of old buildings being haunted, but I never believed in that stuff. I'm a rational guy. But this was something else. I tried talking to some of the locals about it, mentioning the weird stuff I'd been experiencing, but they wouldn't engage. It was like they didn't want to acknowledge it, like they knew something but weren't willing to share. Except for one old man. He worked at the gas station on the edge of town, and I noticed him watching me one night when I stopped for coffee before my shift. After a moment, he finally spoke up. "You working at the old factory?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, not sure where this was going. "Quit," he said, almost too casually. "Get out while you can." I laughed it off, but he just stared at me, his expression dead serious. "Do you know what they used to do there?" he asked. "No," I said, my curiosity piqued. "What?" He leaned in, lowering his voice even more. "That place ain't right. It never was. They built it on old land. Bad land." "What do you mean, bad land?" I asked. He glanced around like he was making sure no one else could hear us. The factory wasn't built for production. It was built for containment. They weren't making things, they were keeping something in. I felt a chill run down my spine. What were they keeping in? He didn't answer. Just shook his head and muttered, "You'll find out soon enough." I didn't sleep much that night, and by the time my shift rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't stop thinking about what the old man had said. I had been so focused on the strange things happening in the factory that I hadn't even considered why the place felt so wrong. That night, I made the rounds like usual. But when I got to the basement, a part of the factory I had always avoided, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A door. It was different from the others, made of thick steel, with a series of strange symbols etched into the frame. and it was padlocked, 3 heavy locks sealing it shut. My flashlight flickered as I stood there, staring at it, and that's when I heard it. Scratching. Coming from the other side of the door. At first, it was faint, like nails dragging across the metal. But then it grew louder, more frantic, like something, or someone, was desperate to get out. I backed away, my heart pounding, and just as I turned to run, the lights in the basement went out. I was plunged into complete darkness. The only sound was the scratching, growing more and more intense. And then came the voice. It wasn't a whisper this time, it was clear, sharp, and right next to me. Let me out. I don't remember much after that. I think I blacked out from fear. The next thing I knew, I was outside the factory, sitting in my car with no memory of how I got there. I quit that night. Never went back. A week later, the factory was closed for renovations, but I know the truth. They're not fixing anything. They're trying to keep whatever's down there locked away. But here's the thing, Reddit, I keep having the same nightmare. Every night, I'm back in that basement, standing in front of that door. And every night, the scratching gets louder. Whatever's in there, it's not done with me. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to go back to my normal life, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my mind replaying that moment in the basement. The voice. The scratching. It haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that door was somehow tied to me, like it had reached out from the darkness and grabbed hold of my soul. I started avoiding sleep, spending late nights at the 24-hour diner in town, trying to keep my mind off things. I'd sip on coffee and read the same dog-eared book over and over again, hoping that if I stayed awake long enough, the nightmares would fade. But they didn't. One night, I was at the diner when I overheard a conversation at the table next to me. A group of locals was talking about strange occurrences in Fairhaven, things I hadn't heard during my brief time there. They mentioned livestock going missing, lights flickering in the town, and how the factory had been the epicenter of it all. Curiosity got the better of me. I leaned in closer, pretending to be engrossed in my book. One of the men spoke up, a burly guy with a thick beard. You know what they say about that factory, right? Built over cursed ground. Can't trust anything that happens there. Another guy, younger and more timid, replied, they say the last watchman disappeared without a trace. Just like that. I felt my heart drop. I had never heard that before. What happened to him? I thought. As the conversation continued, I learned more about the factory's history. They said it had been built during a time when the town was thriving, but a series of accidents had led to its decline. Workers reported hearing voices, seeing things that shouldn't be there, and then the factory was shut down for good. But even then, no one really left it alone. Some locals would sneak in, claiming they were drawn to it, feeling the pull of something dark and powerful. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go back to the factory. I needed to confront whatever was haunting me, to understand what was going on. Maybe, I thought, if I faced it head-on, I could put it all to rest. That following weekend, I drove back to Fairhaven. The sun was setting as I approached the factory, casting long shadows across the ground. My heart raced as I parked and gathered my supplies, a flashlight, a crowbar, and a small camera to document whatever I found. I stepped inside, and a shiver ran down my spine. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the familiar smell of dust and decay hit me hard. I started my rounds, but this time, I was looking for answers. I headed straight for the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the steel door, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was as if I was meant to be there, like the door was calling me. I shone my flashlight on the padlocks and took a deep breath. I began working on the locks with the crowbar. To my surprise, they came off more easily than I expected, almost like they were just waiting for someone to open the door. As the last lock fell away, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. "Just do it," I muttered to myself. "You have to know." With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pulled the door open. The darkness inside was impenetrable. I stepped in, and the moment I did, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath again, swirling in the air like a ghost. My flashlight flickered, and I quickly turned it on, revealing a small room filled with dust and cobwebs. The walls were covered in strange symbols similar to those on the door, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I stepped further inside. My feet crunched on broken glass, and I turned to look down, startled by what I saw, a series of old photographs scattered across the floor. I bent down to pick one up, and my breath caught in my throat. The photo showed a group of people, workers, I assumed, standing proudly in front of the factory. But in the background, lurking just out of sight, was a shadowy figure, barely visible but unmistakably there. I flipped through more photos, and the unease only grew. In each one, the same shadowy figure appeared, always watching, always lurking. It was as if it had been part of the factory's history, haunting the people who had worked there. Then I found something that made my blood run cold, a handwritten journal. I opened it, my hands trembling, and began to read. The entries were filled with panic, fear, and madness. The writer described the voices growing louder, the figure becoming bolder, reaching out to them in their dreams. The final entry was scrawled in a frenzy, the ink smudged and desperate. "It's not just a voice. It wants to escape. I can feel it in my bones." Suddenly, the scratching returned. It echoed through the small room, reverberating in my skull. I dropped the journal and turned to run, but before I could reach the door, a freezing gust of wind slammed it shut. I was trapped. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and the voice returned, now screaming. "Let me out." Panic flooded my mind as I pounded on the door, desperately trying to open it. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with energy, and I felt a heavy weight pressing down on me, like the very air was alive with hostility. "Let me out," the voice screamed again, and I felt a sudden surge of energy rush through me. It was as if whatever was behind that door was reaching out, trying to pull me into its darkness. I staggered back, my breath quickening, feeling the walls closing in. In a burst of adrenaline, I lunged for the door and threw my weight against it. It budged just enough for me to slip through, and I slammed it shut behind me. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding, not daring to look back. When I finally burst out into the main floor of the factory, I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. I was shaking, the adrenaline coursing through me as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The shadows around me felt thicker, darker, and I could swear I could still hear the voice whispering, taunting me. But I wasn't done yet. I had to understand what was happening. I had to uncover the truth. The following days were a blur of frantic research. I dove deep into the history of the factory in the town, scouring old newspaper articles, town records, and even interviewing locals. I learned that the factory had originally been built for textile production, but had shifted to a more sinister purpose. The whispers suggested that the land had been cursed long before the factory was erected, and the townsfolk believed the original owners had sacrificed something in the name of profit. The more I uncovered, the more I felt like I was unraveling a tangled web of horror. The strange occurrences, the shadowy figure, the whispers, they all pointed back to one thing: a malevolent entity that had been trapped for decades, feeding off the fear and despair of those who came into contact with it. Finally, I found a way to confront it. A local historian, a woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, had been studying the factory's history for years. She had experienced some of the same strange occurrences and was eager to help. We arranged to meet at the factory one night, hoping to perform a cleansing ritual she believed could drive the entity away. As we prepared for the ritual, I felt a mix of hope and dread. I gathered sage, salt, and candles, while she brought old texts and prayers. We lit the candles in a circle and began chanting the words from her book. The atmosphere shifted, the air thick with tension. As we recited the final line of the ritual, I felt the temperature drop again. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and I could hear the scratching return, louder than ever. The voice echoed around us, furious now, screaming, "You cannot keep me here. I will not be contained." Mrs. Hawthorne pressed on, her voice steady, but I could see fear flickering in her eyes. The shadows began to twist and contort, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room. The lights flickered and dimmed as the temperature continued to drop. Suddenly, one of the candles extinguished, plunging half the circle into darkness. In that moment, I could see the figure clearly for the first time. It was a man, gaunt and pale, with eyes that burned like embers. He reached out, as if trying to break through the barrier we had created, his expression twisted in rage and despair. "Let me out," he screamed, and I could feel the raw power of his voice wash over me, a wave of panic surging through my body. I had to act quickly. "We need to finish the ritual," I shouted to Mrs. Hawthorne, desperation fueling my voice. "Now." With renewed urgency, we continued our chanting, our voices rising above the chaos. The entity thrashed against our barrier, the air vibrating with anger. I could see the walls of the factory shuddering as if the very building was protesting our intrusion. Just as I thought we might be overwhelmed, Mrs. Hawthorne's voice reached a crescendo, and I could feel the energy in the room shift. "You are not welcome here," she shouted, her words piercing through the darkness. "You have no power over us." In that moment, a brilliant light erupted from the candles, illuminating the entire room. The shadows recoiled, and the figure screamed, the sound echoing like 1,000 wails. "No," it cried, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The light faded, and the air felt different, lighter, less oppressive. I could breathe again. Mrs. Hawthorne and I stood in shock, staring at the empty space where the figure had been moments before. The room was still and silent, devoid of the cold and darkness that had enveloped us. We had done it. But as we left the factory that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I felt free, yet a part of me remained tethered to that darkness. I would no longer be haunted by the entity, but the memories would linger, reminders of the shadows that could so easily return. After that night, I decided to leave Fairhaven for good. I didn't want to be tempted back to that cursed place. I found a new job, moved to a different town, and tried to rebuild my life. But the memories stayed with me, flashes of the factory, the scratching, the voice that had once screamed for release. Years later, I still think about that night. Sometimes, I find myself wondering what happened to the entity, if it truly was banished or merely lying in wait, biding its time for someone else to discover the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Story 4. I was hired to test a virtual reality game, but I can't tell what's real anymore. When I first got the email, I thought it was some kind of joke. "Congratulations. You've been selected as a beta tester for the most immersive VR experience ever created." I hadn't signed up for anything, but the money they were offering was too good to ignore. As someone who's been struggling to make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck, the idea of sitting at home and playing a video game for a hefty payment was a no-brainer. I'd been a gamer most of my life, and I had a decent VR rig, though I wasn't much for beta testing. Still, it seemed like a quick, easy way to make some money. Little did I know, I was signing up for a nightmare I still haven't escaped. The instructions were simple. They shipped me a state-of-the-art VR headset, one I'd never seen before. Sleek, black, no brand name or logo on it. The accompanying letter said it was designed by a private company that wanted to keep their tech under wraps until the official release. It looked like a prototype, with smooth edges and a minimalist design, almost alien in its appearance. I was to test the headset for 2 hours a day, for 7 days straight, and give detailed feedback. Easy enough, right? I set everything up the day I got it. Plugged in the headset, connected it to my computer, and sat down in my gaming chair. The moment I put it on, I was blown away by how comfortable it was. It felt more like it was floating on my head than sitting on it. As soon as it booted up, I was transported to the game's menu, a simple, white room with a single door in front of me. No tutorial, no instructions, just that door. The realism was breathtaking. I could see every detail in the room, right down to the texture of the floor. It was like stepping into another world entirely. I reached out to open the door, and my hand moved in perfect sync with my real-world hand. I pushed the door open, and suddenly, I was in what looked like a bustling city. The graphics were unlike anything I'd ever seen. I could feel the wind on my skin, hear the distant hum of traffic, even smell the faint scent of food being cooked by vendors in the street. This wasn't just a game, it felt real. But that's when things started to get weird. At first, everything was fine. The game world was rich and detailed, and the NPCs, non-player characters, were astonishingly lifelike. They'd greet me, ask how I was, go about their day in ways that felt natural. I wandered around the city, exploring shops, talking to random characters, and occasionally completing minor tasks that popped up on my HUD. It was around the second hour of play that I noticed something strange. One of the NPCs, a woman selling flowers on the corner, kept glancing at me. Not in the normal, programmed way that characters in games do when you approach them. No, it was more unsettling. She followed me with her eyes as I walked by, her gaze lingering for too long. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a weird glitch. But then, the next day, the same thing happened again. She was there, in the exact same spot, watching me. The third day is when everything spiraled. As I wandered through the city, I noticed something. The people around me were starting to act strange. One man walked right up to me, stared into my face, and said, "You don't belong here." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. It wasn't the kind of scripted line you'd expect from an NPC. His tone, his expression, it felt like he was real. I pulled off the headset and sat there for a few minutes, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what I just experienced. Maybe it was some kind of advanced AI designed to make the game more immersive, to blur the line between reality and the virtual world. But I had played enough games to know that something felt off. Really off. Still, I pushed through. After all, I had a contract, and the money was good. I figured it was just part of the experience. Maybe it was all some next-level psychological trick to immerse the player even further. So, I kept going. But by day 4, I began to lose track of what was real. The city had started to change. The bright, bustling streets I had explored at the start of the game were now dark, eerie, with an unsettling fog that hung in the air. The NPCs, once friendly and welcoming, now stared at me with empty eyes, as if they were waiting for something. Conversations with them became shorter, more cryptic. One woman I spoke to said, "The walls are thin here. They can hear you." When I asked her who they were, she just smiled and walked away. The worst part was that I began to hear things, voices. Not through my headset, but faintly, as if they were whispering right into my ear. At first, it was just my name. A soft, barely audible Daniel, but then they started saying other things. "You're not supposed to be here. Why won't you leave? Get out." I'd tear the headset off, only to find my apartment dead silent. But my heart would still be racing, as if the voices had followed me out of the game. On the 5th day, I didn't want to play anymore. But the company kept sending emails, encouraging me to continue. They reminded me of the contract I'd signed, the terms and conditions. So, reluctantly, I put the headset back on. That's when I found the alley. The city was darker than ever before, the fog so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I stumbled through the streets, trying to complete whatever meaningless tasks the game had set for me, when I turned a corner and found a narrow alleyway I hadn't seen before. It wasn't marked on the map. It shouldn't have been there. The moment I stepped into it, I knew I had made a mistake. The alley was impossibly long, stretching on forever in both directions. The walls were lined with old, flickering neon signs, their messages indecipherable. The air was cold, colder than it had been anywhere else in the game. And then I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing just at the edge of my vision, barely visible through the fog. They were still, unmoving, watching me. I tried to back out of the alley, but it was like my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. As it got closer, I could see its face, or, rather, the lack of one. It had no features. Just smooth, blank skin where eyes, nose, and a mouth should have been. And it was reaching for me. In a panic, I tore the headset off and threw it across the room. I sat there, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, trying to convince myself it was just a game. Just a really messed up, hyper-realistic game. But the moment I looked around my apartment, my stomach dropped. The fog was outside my window. Not in the game, outside, in the real world. Thick, swirling fog, the same kind that had been in the alley. And worse, there was something moving in it. A shadow, shifting just beyond the glass. I closed the blinds, my hands shaking. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't tell if I was still in the game or if the game had somehow bled into reality. On day 6, I didn't play. I couldn't. I was too terrified of what might happen. I didn't want to see those faceless figures again. But the emails kept coming, more urgent now. They said I needed to complete the full 7 days. That the test wasn't complete, and I was in breach of contract. There were penalties, they warned. Severe penalties. Against my better judgment, I put the headset back on for the 7th and final day. The city was completely empty now. The streets, once filled with bustling NPCs, were deserted. The fog had consumed everything, turning the vibrant, detailed world into a shadowy wasteland. I walked through the streets, every footstep echoing in the oppressive silence. That's when I heard it. A voice, not like the others. This one was deep, guttural, and it said just one word. Welcome. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling. I tumbled through darkness, my mind spinning, until I hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. I looked around and found myself in a room, a perfect replica of my apartment. But there was one difference. Sitting in my chair, wearing the same clothes I had been wearing moments before, was me. It turned its head and smiled. I stared in shock as my own voice came from its mouth. You took too long to leave. I ripped the headset off, scrambling out of my chair, my heart racing. But as I looked around, I realized I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The walls were the same, the furniture was the same, but the air was thick with fog, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and twist. The game had followed me into the real world. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm still in the game, or if the game has somehow invaded my life. Every time I close my eyes, I see those faceless figures, hear their whispers. And every night, when the fog rolls in outside my window, I know they're out there, waiting. If you ever get an offer to beta test an immersive VR experience, don't take it. You might never come back.